Hi, everyone, and welcome to No Way to Grow Up, which is our panel conversation with students and teachers about the pandemic's effects on schools, learning, and social development. My name is Philip Pantuso, and I'm the managing editor of the River Newsroom. Thanks for joining us today. I'll note that we are recording this event so that it can be available for folks afterward. Only the person speaking on screen will be recorded. If you need it, closed captioning is available, which you can enable on Zoom at the bottom of the screen. I'll introduce my co-moderator and the panelists shortly, but first a couple of housekeeping notes. You can follow The River at therivernewsroom.com, and if you're new to us, we're a digital news magazine that does in-depth reporting on issues in the Hudson Valley and Catskills. We don't run ads and rely heavily on member support, and by joining our membership program, you get perks like free access to events like this one, our Climate Lab newsletter, discounts on other Chronogram media publications, and more. You can learn more at the link that is about to appear. We're thrilled that the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz is co-sponsoring this event. The IDMH seeks to address the diversity of disaster mental health demands in the region, state, nation, and global community, so that all those impacted by disaster trauma have access to the mental health support they need. To accomplish this goal, IDMH provides leadership to advance the of disaster mental health and trauma response through training, research, consultation, and service. I'll pass it to my co-moderator now, Ryan Elamine.
Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Just as a brief introduction, my name is Rayon Elamine. I'm currently the editorial intern at The River, and I'm the junior at Vassar College. Part of the reason I'm helping moderate this panel right now is because I've spent a good chunk of the last 2 months working on a story that focused on Poughkeepsie High School and the Poughkeepsie School District. The story, which actually just came out about an hour ago, discussed the ways in which kind of broad systemic issues have been negatively impacting the school for almost a century now. Moreover, the school covered the ways in which people within the community, like many of the panelists featured here today, have been working diligently to overcome some of these systemic hurdles. So with that being said, I think this is a good time to pass it back to Philip and introduce some of the panelists today.
Thanks, Ryan. Panelists now. Dr. Carla Vermeulen is an associate of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in disaster mental health, grief counseling, and developmental psychology. Her third coming of age post 9/11 examines the impact of today's stressful world on emerging adults. It was published last year by Oxford University Press. Amaya Spence is a senior at New Paltz, where she studies psychology and journalism and is currently serving as editor-in-chief of the campus newspaper. She is also a freelance journalist and the former editorial in The River. She was one of Dr. Vermeulen's students as she was pastor. Sophie Frank is a senior at Ontario High School. She has written articles for The River about virtual learning and teen mental health during the pandemic, one of which was also published in Chronogram and shared on Facebook by Congressman Antonio Delgado. Here on campus for local politicians, Sophie is an inspiring journalist, an activist, and an amateur baker. Shauna Andrades is a teacher at Poughkeepsie High School, where she has taught since 2008. She currently teaches global economics. Shauna is also president and co-founder of Teen Schools in Poughkeepsie City. Alicia Cure has been teaching at partner and 3 children. Thanks to all of them for joining us, and we'll just get right into the questions now. The first one I wanted to start with was, I wanted to kind of go back before the pandemic to kind of set some context. Dr. Vermeulen, your research focuses on the numerous stressors that were already shaping the developmental environment of emerging adults. To name a few: climate change, school shootings, racial inequality, student debt, social media. Can you briefly summarize how these factors and more were affecting young people pre-COVID? If rates of depression and anxiety are skyrocketing now, what was the pre-pandemic baseline and what are we looking at?
Yes, thank you, Philip. Yeah, so I don't want to overwhelm people with statistics, although that's probably exactly what I'm about to do. But yeah, even before the pandemic, a lot of people are probably aware there really was what was starting to be viewed as a bit of a crisis in mental health for young people. So just some stats on that, and these are pulled from the wonderful advocacy group called Mental Health America, which does a lot of education and destigmatization around mental health issues. They've got tons of resources at mhanational.org. But they do a major national survey every year. And so I went back and I looked at kind of the pre-pandemic versus the post-pandemic rates on some of these issues. And even before the pandemic, they were already tracking really big increases, particularly in youth depression. So the number in 2015, the number of 12 to 17-year-olds, so these are adolescents that we're looking at, who were reporting at least one major depressive episode, that went from 8.7% in 2015 to 12.6% in 2018. So already a 50% increase before the pandemic. And then as of 2021, that went up to 15%. So it's hard to, kind of, I don't know, understand what these numbers mean, but nationally, that means that in 2021, there were 3,755,000 adolescents who experienced a major depressive episode, and more than 2.5 million youth with chronic severe depression. And the rates of those, I think it's really worth noting, were highest among multiracial kids. New York, on the good side, is slightly below the national average for depression at 13.3%, but that's still, close to 200,000 severely depressed young people. And even more troublingly, in 2022, only about a quarter of the people with major depression received consistent treatment. 60% of those young people with major depression did not receive any mental health treatment at all. And that's really problematic because we know treating depression in adolescence, or the earlier the onset we can catch it, the more effective that's going to be in terms of preventing that from carrying on into adulthood. Just a couple more things, and then I'll turn it back over to the others. I think it's really important also to recognize that, it's not only a crisis when we're looking at clinical level reactions like anxiety and depression, but even just at the kind of subclinical level of suffering that many young people are going through. So again, from the Mental Health America survey from 2018, so pre-pandemic, I'll just give a few of these. A lot of what they found was things that had a really negative impact, both on academic performance and on mental health. So more than half of the 12 to 17-year-olds said that they were easily distracted. About half said they found it difficult to concentrate. And then really troublingly, 49% said they often felt hopeless. 63% said they often worried a lot. And 48% said they often felt angry or irritable. And last thing I'll throw out here is that was really consistent with my own research that I did for my book, which was not with adolescents, but with emerging adults, so 18 to 29-year-olds. This was conducted in 2019, so also pre-pandemic. 29% of my survey participants said they often or always felt anger about their situation. 31% often or always felt fear. 37% often or always felt sadness. And kind of shockingly, 47% often or always felt anxiety about their lives. And I'm willing to bet those rates would be even higher now after the pandemic.
Yeah. Amaya, this is not just your lived experience, but something you've been studying as well. I wanted to ask you and the other students on the panel, I think folks from older generations struggle to understand about some of the challenges of growing up today.
Sure. So I wanted to start by saying that, hearing the phrase generation disaster and learning about it through Professor Vermeulen has been really, really useful to me in figuring out the answer to this question. I think that it's a sharp contrast to what we hear a lot from older generations, which maybe older generations would call us the crybaby generation, because there is a very big narrative that we are just overly sensitive, and that's the reason for our mental health woes and a lot of things that are going on in the world right now. I think that it's been really difficult for there to be a middle ground between recognizing the positives of the time that we're living in. There's a romanticization of our generation, thinking about how we're living in the age of technology, the information era. And we do have a lot of privileges available to us, but then there's also the underbelly of that truth where, yes, we have the internet, but we also have cyberbullying. We have the internet, we have cancel culture, we have revolutions, but we also have counter revolutions. There's a lot of ways that the changes that we've experienced have gone really intensely in both directions. So I think one thing that I think is really important for the older generations to recognize is just that like there isn't really a benefit to glorifying this generation, or to making it seem like it's all been doom and gloom. I think that it's really the first step is to call it generation disaster so that we can understand what the issue is and then understand how to move forward.
I want to pose a question to the educators, particularly Shauna and Alicia. Two issues we know predate the pandemic. Districts have typically always been understaffed and teachers have almost always been underpaid. And like so many other facets in American society, COVID has kind of revealed some underlying fissures within public education. And I'm curious, what was the hardest part of your job before the pandemic, and how, if at all, has that changed what it means for you to be an educator within that space?
Sure, I guess I'll begin with that. So I think pre-pandemic, the biggest issue was always just lack of resources or inequitable distribution of resources. When we look at our different schools, even in our own area, urban, suburban, rural, we see vastly different school experiences for those children. And these include things at the classroom level, like classroom supplies, student-teacher ratios, having access to student support staff like guidance counselors, social workers. We have one social worker in our school for 1,200 students. And after the pandemic, we haven't received an additional one. So, all of those issues that the professor was talking about that may have increased with the pandemic, we don't see increased access to the support services that might help students with those. One of the issues with understaffing that you mentioned, I think that gets overlooked, is that we basically have the staff right now to cover our core curriculum. What we don't have the staff for are these extracurricular, these elective courses, right? And so these elective courses are the things that can get students really excited, especially adolescents, about learning. They can also help drive them into new career paths. So we've had to cut back on things like we had a psychology course. We haven't been able to offer it in the past 3 years because we don't have enough staff. Our current staff is working on credit recovery and learning loss, and so without that psychology elective, what about those students who found their drive and their desire to study psychology in college? Maybe they're not finding that pathway anymore. So I think that could have a really dire impact on our students that are going to graduate in the next couple of years. The one problem I think the pandemic has ironically solved is our lack of technology infrastructure. We were not a one-to-one district. We are now, but just barely. So like if a student's technology breaks or has an issue, we don't have replacements right now. And even though we got money to get all these new devices, we don't have additional staff to maintain them. So as these devices start to need service, we're going to have a real backlog. And again, students are going to lose their access to that technology as they wait for it to get repaired.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I feel really lucky that I teach in a district that tends to have the resources we need. We're a more rural district, so our challenge with technology was that a lot of our kids, I shouldn't say a lot, but a portion of our kids didn't have access to the internet when we first sent everybody home in March of 2020. And, I'll agree that one of the benefits was really embracing the technology and seeing how we could use the technology in new ways and to support students wherever they were. I think, one of the things that's really changed during the pandemic and is that mental health concerns, which were always there, are at the forefront now, absolutely 100% at the forefront. And that when teachers are getting together to talk about how we teach or what kinds of things we're assigning or how we're giving grades, that mental health concerns are right there. And I think teachers are talking a little bit more about, what's the purpose of the grade right now? How are we grading things? Should it be more effort-based or more performance-based? And those decisions were always there, but they didn't seem as weighted as they do now. That really playing out what the effect of grades on students will be, or is this assignment something that, is necessary? Is it something that should be optional so that kids don't lose an opportunity to do something, but maybe some of the students will see it as a burden, and maybe it's not worth the burden that they'll see. And so I think, for me, the pandemic really has called into question everything about education. And I know that's not exclusive to education, but really considering the value judgments that we have and the decisions that we make, on a day-to-day basis, even on a period-to-period basis. That's been, the biggest thing to me, is that there are so many decisions, and everything seems very much weighted in a different way than it did before.
Yeah, and following up with that, and Sophie, I'm curious in particular what you think about this. Now that school has been back in person for, generally almost the entire school year, what's been the most surprising thing? It can be positive or negative.
The most surprising thing has definitely been realizing how difficult the transition from virtual to in person would be. I think I assumed it would come naturally because it was like the one thing I was hoping for over a year, but it wasn't. And the aspects of school that have always been hard for me, like standardized testing or anything like that, that didn't come naturally, I had to deal with all of those things. And then the things that had always come naturally that I'd always loved, like projects, working with peers, teachers, talking, that had a really steep readjustment period that I had to get through, and finding the stuff that was always the hardest for me made worse by the pandemic, and the stuff that I had loved made surprisingly difficult, was a kind of tough come down. But I think we're kind of entering a more normal place, and that readjustment period is ending, and that is a really reassuring feeling for me.
I also completely agree with Sophie. I think that for the entirety of the pandemic, I had this really strong belief that like when we got back to classes, it was going to be the most glorious thing. I was going to dress up every morning. I was just going to love all of my classes. It was just going to be a seamless transition. And that really wasn't the case. I think it makes sense in retrospect because during the pandemic, I could take 30 minutes to do one outing, and that one outing would be my only outing for the whole week, and it would be the supermarket. And then I'd get back from the supermarket and I would just watch TV and be like, wow, that was an outing. And now it's hours of classes each day. So I've learned to give myself grace in how difficult it was to process that switch. But I think I'm not alone. I think I haven't seen attendance go back to where they were before the pandemic because it's such a hard switch. I also think that there are some little things that will never feel normal again. Going back to what Sophie mentioned about tests, I have always had testing anxiety, but during the pandemic, it was less bad because I could be listening to music while I was taking a test, and I was sitting on my couch and just doing things that made testing less scary. And I'll never forget my first test when I came back from the pandemic, just being so scary because it was absolutely quiet. There was 40 people in a room. And I think and this has been an idea thrown around a lot, that like going back to normal has really made me realize how many things should have never been normal. We should have never been taking tests like that. That's an anxiety inducing situation. So I think that there are a lot of things that when I went back to school just like stood out to me as more odd, that were always normal to us. They just became more weird now that there was like another option.
I'm curious too, from the teachers, and I'll include you, Dr. Vermeulen, if there's anything that was kind of surprising or unexpected once you kind of transitioned back into the classroom.
Yeah, I was trying to think of something really surprising, and I couldn't come up with anything on, that specifically, but I do feel, and I recognize and I acknowledge that like Amaya, I really underestimated how challenging that transition back would be. And that's both, I know, like, I was thrilled to get back into the classroom. I hate teaching in a mask, delighted that that's about to be ending, at least hopefully, knock wood. But I was so happy to just see my students again. And I think I overemphasized my own happiness at that. And I really underestimated how challenging that was going to be for some students. Because like, I know my health situation, I know my resources. I don't know that for all of my students. And so I think I really did not do a great job, frankly, at when something was brought to my attention, I hope I reacted to it appropriately and accommodatingly, but I don't think I did enough to really think through like, okay, there are going to be students who are still, maybe they've all been vaccinated, that was mandated, but maybe they're living with people who haven't been, or they have other health issues, or I certainly know that some of my fellow faculty members have health issues or have concerns themselves. So it was just that kind of, I think I kind of, I don't know, focused on my own happiness about that return without adequately taking into consideration that other people were not in the same place that I was. And I will own that for sure.
So I think one of the things that was most surprising to me, and it was not totally unexpected, but still the level of it was surprising, was the social emotional component that, students were stunted in their development. I teach 10th grade. And so that means for many of my students, they had not set foot in a classroom since they were 8th graders, because we were very slow to come to hybrid. And when we did go to hybrid, about 80% of our families chose to keep their children at home. So to have behaviors that I would maybe expect more of in a middle schooler, as a high school teacher, it sort of took me aback, and I had to take a moment and think to myself, okay, how do I approach this? Teaching students, when you're frustrated in class because maybe I'm standing in front of the board and you can't see what's behind me, what's the proper way to address me and ask for that need to be met? That is an appropriate way to address a teacher or another human being. And so I sort of had to take a step back and work with some students on those basic social interactions that they just hadn't had the opportunity and the experience to work out as 8th graders and 9th graders, and coming to that sophomore year.
I'll agree with that too, that, we remind ourselves a lot of, how old the kids were when they left, for each grade level, it's different. But to be conscious that some of the social experiences and the socializing experiences that the students, I don't want to say they missed, but they had in a different way, a radically different way. So that it's tricky, because in some ways a 10th grader is more mature than some of the 10th graders we've seen in the past, because they've seen things that kids hadn't seen before. They've thought about things that kids were not really thinking about. And then in other ways, there's, less maturity just in certain environments, that 10th graders talk to their teachers in a very different way than 8th graders talk to their teachers. 12th graders talk to their teachers in a very different way than 10th graders. And that it usually all takes care of itself. And now I think we're doing more, direct intervention, reminding ourselves like, oh, here are the things that students missed out on. how can we give them some of those experiences so that, you know, the social and emotional learning, which was a plan, you know, that existed before the pandemic, became much more real, became much more, you know, this is something we all have to think. It's not a curriculum coming from the state that we just kind of play along with. Like, no, this is, you know, as important, if not more important than anything else we're teaching. And I also think one of the things that really surprised me was how overstimulating the school environment felt after being away from the school environment. And I know that that's true for a lot of students, that, you know, when we think about the pace of the day, when people are home, the pace of the day feels very different, even though we were following, you know, the same schedule. That once you're in a school, the idea that, like, you know, 25 kids are going to come into a room and then they're going to leave 40 minutes later, and a new batch is going to come in and they're going to leave 40 minutes later, that it didn't feel the same when we were home. And so I think that a lot of students feel that sense of overstimulation. I know a lot of teachers feel a sense of overstimulation and being overwhelmed just by the pace of everything. Was something I hadn't really expected, because I had been doing this for, you know, almost 20 years before the pandemic started.
Dr. Vermeulen, I'm kind of curious, like, as we continue to measure the social and emotional and psychological impacts of these disruptions, what are you going to be looking for over the next few years as more data becomes available?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of research going on, in particular into mental health issues, as well as educational outcomes of the effect of all of this, you know, this huge and horrible natural experiment we've all been living through. So I think maybe something of a bright side is we are going to learn a lot from this. And I think a lot of people are doing some really good research on sort of specific developmental outcomes. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking not just at, you know, mental health symptoms or experiences, educational experiences, but I'm really curious to see, how is this going to shape this generation's worldview of people who were adolescents or college age during this time? And I'm a developmental psychologist by training, and so that always, you know, that's always kind of my focus. Like, we've all been going through the pandemic, but that's very different if you're experiencing it as an adult, an older adult, a young child, et cetera. So I'm really interested in seeing kind of how will this influence how young people who have been through this really are processing the world, and their expectations of justice and fairness and safety and stability. So, I mean, even before the pandemic, for my book, I had done some research on that particular aspect. And so I was asking, these are emerging adults, so again, 18 to 29-year-olds, about some of these kind of worldview aspects. And in the survey that I did, I found 4 out of 5 said that they, even before the pandemic, agreed that disasters and accidents could happen to anyone. Almost 60% said they were frequently concerned about something bad happening to them or the people they love. And really compellingly, even before the pandemic, I asked, agreement with the statement, I believe the world is generally safe. And only 1 out of 4 agreed with that statement. 31% were neutral about it, and 43% disagreed that the world is generally safe. And comparable numbers agreed with the statement that the world is generally fair. And so I'm just really curious to see, are those perceptions going to be even worse among young people moving forward? And I don't know that they will. I mean, there's also been good things coming out of the pandemic for sure, and bonding, and certainly the heightened awareness of the impact of mental health issues and the need to support people. But yeah, that's something that I'm really particularly interested to see. And again, last stat from this was, I asked agreement with the statement, people should help each other out in times of need. And 4 out of 5 agreed with that, and only 4% disagreed with that statement. So I think that's a positive thing. You know, there's recognition among this generation that they don't do victim blaming. generally. That's what the older people do. They are there for each other. They understand how challenging life is. And so I hope that that is kind of a positive trend that will continue to emerge from this, but we'll have to see.
Kind of sticking to this theme of researching COVID, we've all heard a lot about learning loss over the last little while. One report I read actually found the students in the US fell behind about 5 months in maths and about 4 months in reading. And those losses were especially worse among students in poor and rural districts who are already facing some kind of structural disadvantage. But I think there's still a lot we don't know about COVID-related learning loss. And kind of posing it to everyone, maybe first to you, Dr. Vermeulen, I'm curious, can you talk about what you think is going to happen, and for everyone else, how you're kind of experiencing COVID-related learning loss?
I will actually defer to the high school teachers on this one. I think that's much less of an issue when it comes to college students. But I'm curious to hear from both the high school educators and the younger students.
Oh, sure, I'll start. So in my classroom, what I'm seeing definitely is reading level, a lower reading level than what students came in with before. I work in a district where we often will have gaps in reading level from where they should be on, they might come in well below grade level, but I'm seeing even bigger gaps. And the other issue is sustained focus on a task. So being able to, read an extended piece of writing without, becoming disengaged or distracted. And finally, I'll say that accepting a challenge or challenging oneself beyond what is comfortable or what is easily attainable in terms of a academic task. So, if they don't understand something the first time, asking them to reread it or to go back to the text, there's a little bit more resistance to that, more easily giving up. And when students are done with their work early, because usually in a classroom you have a pretty wide range of student abilities, and so you usually will have those students who are done early, and you might have an enrichment task for them, and you can incentivize it, say we're going to get extra credit, and I just have a lot of kids who are just like, no, I'd rather just sit here, veg out, go on my phone, go on my device, play a game, and I wonder if that is due to using devices more often. What happened? I don't know if you guys could, oh, sorry. I just got a Chrome update that took over my screen. So, with my own child, I know when I was working from home and she was doing school, when she would finish her work early, I would just say, go on your device, go do something. Mommy's got to teach, because I couldn't do both things, right? And so I'm just wondering if that, just could be what it is, that, instead of taking on a more challenging learning experience, I'm just going to do this easy thing.
Yeah, I think in high school, at least I'm also a social studies teacher, the sustained focus on a task is a big one. We're not seeing as much, I guess, we're not seeing as much reading level deficit as just a lack of experience and a lack of comfort with different kinds of tasks. And so, charts and graphs, things that maybe, middle schoolers aren't really exposed to as much. They become new things for high school students where, I used to be able to kind of take for granted that I could show a high school student a chart or a graph or a political cartoon or something like that. And they, oh yeah, I know what to do with this. I know how to interpret it. I know what to look for. And so there's a lot of direct instruction around like how to approach tasks, which I think is making all of us much better teachers, to be honest, because I'm always reminded that there were kids who didn't know how to approach those things beforehand, but most kids could. And now to just assume, I try to go into things assuming that there isn't as much background knowledge or there isn't as much comfort with a task or a skill. And I think the kids are okay. I really do. Not that I'm not concerned about, a lot of the issues facing them, but in terms of, academic deficits in high school students, I'm less concerned. I think they're compensating in lots of ways that they might not have been compensating before. And so I'm really, I think we have to teach differently, but I don't necessarily think that it's, that there's a problem with the students. I think it's just that education has changed, and has to continue to change, because ultimately we're there to teach the students. And so however the students are approaching us is how we respond to them. Now I'll also say I have smaller children who took maybe longer to learn how to read than they might have had there not been a pandemic. But I do think that, our high school kids academically, they're going to be all right.
As a high schooler, I think I felt learning loss most last year when I just felt completely unable or maybe unwilling to reach out, because I used to have an issue. I would take it to a teacher and we'd go back and forth and we'd do it in person. And even if it didn't come naturally, it would come as it needed to. And to think about dealing with the difficulty of learning the subject and trying to set up a Zoom time and deal with my internet issues was just too exhausting to even try it. And I think not only did that lead to a lack of motivation, it also led to me just being like, it's not worth it. Getting a better grade on this cannot possibly be worth the effort of dealing with this. And I think I didn't fully appreciate that school, I have a place there. I have carved out my own learning methods and relationships with people. And with that environment and the isolation of quarantine and the fact that we were expected to do everything we had been, but in a completely different environment, was what that did was make learning kind of a secondary priority. And one of the things I've been trying really intentionally to do when I'm back in school now is do the reaching out that I did and make sure that I'm responding to it and not suffering from all of these learning problems that other people had mentioned.
I think for me, and I recognize that this is like a very privileged perspective that I'm coming from, I think with college, one of my mom's friends recently mentioned this concept to me about like the 80-20-20-80 like principle, where like before college you're learning 80% of the material in the classroom, and then you learn 20% like is reinforced through homework at home. I don't know if I'm saying the wrong numbers, but someone can correct me if I am. And then in college you're learning 20% of the material in the classroom, and then 80% of it you're learning on your own through your own readings and like whatever assignments you have at home. And I think as like a very busy college student before the pandemic, that 80% at home was of course intense. So the pandemic, where my extracurricular activities were remote and easier to do, and I was very bored, there was definitely a mirror in front of me that allowed me to see like where my intrinsic learning was most. I read a psychology textbook, maybe cover to cover, which I never would have done if it wasn't a pandemic and I wasn't very bored, and also just like having time to just read what I wanted to read and not what I had time to read. So I think in that sense, I don't know if this is horrible to say on a panel of educators, but I think that it was maybe like a commonly known thing that like for the first semester of the pandemic, you did not have to learn. It was very easy to just have a textbook open during a test. Like you did not have to like know the material you were being tested on. So I think that in that sense, the fact that like people I knew were still reading everything they could because in only the classes they were super interested in, did provide a way for people to just be focused on learning and not necessarily be focused on grades, which I think is phenomenal, because all the learning that was happening was just because you wanted to read and you wanted to keep going, because my teachers were like very forgiving of everything else. Yeah, so I think in some ways that was like really good for me. And then going back, it has been hard for me to get past some of the like little obstacles that I personally think should have never been. Like if I miss class and I read the textbook reading, um, and I'm like caught up, but I missed class and my grade is docked and I'm not going to do as well in the class because I missed the class. There's a lot of other other issues that come up when learning is in person that didn't come up for me when learning was online. So I think that that's like maybe definitely like a minority voice. I think for most people there were learning setbacks, but I think for me there were just like a bunch of like little weird ways where I feel like I learned a lot more during the pandemic than I would have imagined I would have.
I will actually jump in on this, building on what Amaya just said. Yeah, and I remember especially in the semester in March 2020 when we did the pivot very abruptly, and a number of the SUNY New Paltz faculty members had never taught online before, and there was real growing pains, and it was a rough transition. And I remember hearing from a lot of students at that point that they felt like they were teaching themselves, and therefore then they were upset that they were still having to pay the same tuition when they did not feel, at least temporarily, like they were getting the same quality of education. So I think that's kind of the dark side to that for sure as well. And, very upsetting for students, understandably.
Can I just add one thing? Because what Amaya said interested me and like reflects something that I saw as well when I was teaching remotely, is that there were some very small minority of students who thrived learning remotely. These are students who maybe have anxiety or feel overwhelmed in the school environment and could really focus at home. They had environments at home where they could do that. Or students who had negative social interactions with other students, and they might get into fights or things at school, and being at home they were distanced from that social drama. And so I think an unfortunate thing is that in this return to normal, it's like everyone has to go back to the old way, even though for some people that other way was better. And I as Ms. Curlew was saying, I think we really need to take this opportunity to rethink everything in education, including that expectation that we should all learn the same way in the same environment.
Yeah, I kind of want to ask a follow-up there and maybe broaden it to the educators on the panel. Are you doing anything differently? And some of you have sort of alluded to this previously, but are you doing anything differently this academic year to kind of compensate for those setbacks? And how has it kind of changed maybe what you see as your role as an educator? Like has it changed at all sort of how you understand that that position?
I know for myself, I've been a lot more flexible with everything. That I used to be a bigger planner. Like I would go into, I teach AP government and politics, and I used to, go into a quarter, for example. I knew exactly what I was going to assign. I knew exactly when things were going to be due. I knew I knew what I was going to do, and I saw it as my role to help the students, go through what I had planned out for them. And even hearing myself say that, I'm like, I can't imagine that right now. I can't imagine making a plan and being less flexible. And so now I have, the quarters sketched out. But my sketch of the quarter includes, well, maybe this and maybe this, and we'll either do this project or this project. And, I find myself really trying to respond to what the kids need, or what their strengths are, what feels like it might not work. And, I think that is in a way a redefinition of the role. Like, teachers tend to be very, independent people who are in charge of their own classes, and to see it as a give and take with the students, is, I feel like my mind's been open to a new way of looking at things. And it's not that I ever intentionally like ignored, what the students needed. It's just that it wasn't so present for me. That generally kids could navigate what kids had been navigating for, the past several years. And now it's just different. And it's not that I'm saying that they can't do the things that they used to do. It's that some of those things just don't make sense anymore. Some of those things are unnecessary, and different things are necessary now. And so, I just find myself like constantly reflecting and reevaluating. And I just think this is a big period of realignment, in education, where part of what I think we realized during the pandemic is that, all the information people need is at their fingertips. It really is. That it's become, teaching history and government and things like that. It's very much information based, or it has been very information based. And now it feels more like, well, what do you do when you don't know something? How do you find it out? How do you take in the new information? What are the things that you really just need to know so that you can understand the new information that's coming in? And what kind of information do you not have to memorize? It'll just be there when you need it. And so I think that it's really it's been a very eye-opening experience, I think. And people who can reflect and people who can reassess and reevaluate are doing it. And then it's trickier when you get kind of stuck in your ways.
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of that. In terms of, I was very much the very strict planner type of person. And, I think one thing the pandemic taught me is in many parts of my life is that, you have to sort of let go of some of that control. And it's a good thing when you do. So two things I'll say. One is collaboration. During the pandemic, especially, last year when I was working from home and my daughter was at home, doing third grade, there was just no way to get it all done. I mean, you had to really take your whole curriculum. The kinds of activities that you did wouldn't work online. So you were really rewriting everything from scratch. And so I reached out to a like-minded colleague who teaches the same subject. I said, let's do this together. And she was like, great, I love it. And what that enabled us to do was be more innovative, share ideas with each other, incorporate different kinds of technology and engagement tools that we wouldn't have had time individually to figure out and learn, to try to make the learning more engaging. And also we both really made a commitment to trying to thread through our curriculum issues of importance to our students, so that they could see themselves in the curriculum, so they could make connections with history and the present day. And as Ms. Kula said, it's not that we weren't doing these things before, but doing them in a really intentional way, I think made all the difference. And also this collaboration that I've started with, not just one, but a few colleagues has really enriched my experience as an educator. The second thing I think is just slowing down. As a social studies teacher, especially, we have this curriculum, and it was like, got to get through the curriculum. Like my job, my role is to make sure these kids know all these facts for the Regents exam, right? Because they need to pass that. And now it's like, yeah, there's a curriculum out there, but what are the things that are important to spend time on, right? Not just important to me, but important to the students, the things that they will find engaging, inspiring, make them curious. A good example is we've spent a lot of time talking about Ukraine and connecting it. Over the past few weeks, we were studying World War II, we were studying the Cold War. It was, just kind of perfect timing, and they're really engaged and they're really interested in it. And in the past, I think I would have felt like, I don't know if I have time for that. I really got to get on to the next topic. So I think that is a good thing that's come out of all this.
Yeah, 100% agree with both of your statements about all of this. Yeah, flexibility is all. I have also become perfectly willing to throw out that day's lesson plan because we're going to talk about Ukraine, or we're going to talk about a school shooting, or we're going to talk about whatever is bothering them. Because especially for the subjects that I tend to teach, that is kind of part of it. I teach disaster psychology and I teach lifespan development. So kind of everything is, I can justify it all fitting in. But they don't want to hear me lecturing from a PowerPoint. I mean, I still do that sometimes. They want to have the material connected to their lives, and they want the stressors that they are going through validated. They want people to understand that they are seeing memes on TikTok about World War III about to start and that they're going to get drafted, and they need to process that in a way, hopefully with an informed educator who can place that in context and help them understand the likelihood of some of these things actually happening. And so, I mean, I guess I felt very privileged that I'm sort of mid-career in terms of my teaching experience at this point. So I felt like I had the competence and the confidence to be able to do that. I think having that openness is probably a lot harder for early career educators. Yeah, but I think whatever we more experienced folks can do to mentor the early career educators is really, really necessary and important to kind of help them find their way and get away from that. I got to cover the material on the syllabus to I'm going to cover what is actually going to help my students learn what ultimately they need to learn, even if that's not exactly what we thought we were going to cover today.
Okay, switching gears a little bit, when you're young, there's so much that's riding on every year. We've talked about the ways that the pandemic has disrupted the present and it will have ripple effects into the future in other ways we've also discussed. But Sophie and Amaya, you're both graduating seniors, and I'm curious how it's affected your preparation for whatever comes next. And I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this too, Ryan. But maybe Sophie, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I haven't really talked about in regards to this whole experience, but that has definitely impacted my idea with any future plans, is that the pandemic was more than altered school or altered social situations. It prompted like major reckonings about my life, the kind of person I want to be, just deeper stuff than I anticipated. And so for my future plans, it prompted personal reflection, made me think about who I want to be. And though completely unexpected and not entirely due to the pandemic, writing articles for the River and reading the news all the time to stay connected, because that was really all we had, prompted a career idea. And now I want to pursue journalism. So two different sort of ideas, but that's where I'm at right now.
For me, I think that, of course, like one of the number one ways that the pandemic impacted my job prospects is that it gave me immense anxiety about them. I think that, so I've always been focused mainly on journalism and psychology as potential career paths. And I think the pandemic made both of those things extremely necessary. Like news and mental health support were more important than ever during the pandemic. And I think that it really didn't help in that way where like I was like, both of these things are incredibly important. But I think one thing that I was really impacted by was like craving stability. I think I saw a lot of my friends' families either be really supported by their jobs because they were off from work but still getting paid, or not supported by their jobs because they weren't in work, but they weren't getting paid. And I think it just shifted a mindset that I had. I think that I used to have, again, I'll recognize like a slightly privileged perspective where in high school, I had a very strong drive to follow fulfillment over money because I really wanted to do the thing that was going to make me feel like I made the impact on the world that I needed to make over, even if that meant like a smaller paycheck. Everyone was telling me journalists aren't going to make money. I was saying, well, journalists are going to change the world, and that's what matters. I think then the pandemic happened, and I said, okay, maybe money matters, maybe insurance matters, but I still do want to like have this really big impact on the world. So I think that it didn't necessarily push me in one specific direction. It definitely did put more questions into mind. And then it also made me question why I had those questions. It also did make me say, why is it that a certain job will make me more likely to survive a global pandemic? That's not right. Like, everyone should be able to have healthcare during this pandemic, and the fact that I'm changing what I want to do with my life because I want healthcare is absolutely abominable. So, I mean, that's not a helpful answer because I just put more questions out, but that's really what the pandemic did for me. It put a lot more questions out, and it gave me a lot of new perspectives about what's important to me.
I can touch on my perspective a little bit. I think kind of like Sophie and Amaya, like reckoning with my own personhood and my employment or like my future employment were things that I thought about a lot. I think more so for me too, like COVID didn't necessarily exist in a vacuum. So I grew up, just sort of background, I grew up in Lebanon for a lot of my life. And during COVID especially, the situation in the country deteriorated. And for a good chunk of it, I wasn't able to be at home, given what was happening. And so it forced me to lean on a foundational support system and build one in the United States in a way that, I hadn't before. And for that, I think I'm really grateful. And in a way that like creating a home in a space that I initially never thought would be possible was kind of an unexpected, maybe positive impact of the pandemic. But yeah, kind of in a lot of the same things that Sophie and Amaya said, just thinking foundationally about who I am as a person and how do I fit into different pockets within society, and then why some of those are, like why can't journalists sometimes not have health insurance? I think that's a big one. But yeah.
Remind everyone to support the River Newsroom. Okay, moving on to another question here. So the cost of college stayed the same despite being remote, which to me anyway seems a little unfair for what we have described as kind of a less rich experience in a lot of ways. And now coming back, some universities and schools are trying to pack more students into classes. I'm wondering, both from a student and teacher perspective, what impacts you feel this might have going forward, and also, is there anything that any of your institutions are doing to help address the financial crisis that students might be facing?
That one's on me, huh? Yeah, this is such a difficult issue, and it's so frustrating, especially being part of the SUNY system. All of these policies are not set by SUNY New Paltz; they're from SUNY Central, and yet the SUNY New Paltz administration is the one who faces the upset and the anger from the students, even though their hands are basically tied on all these issues. I completely get the sensitivity and the frustration, and that this seems very unfair. And from the faculty perspective, yes, we are being asked to do more without more compensation in turn. So I'm kind of team student in terms of concern about these. I do not know what the answer is. I wish I did. We will be getting a new chancellor. We have an interim chancellor now. We'll be getting a new chancellor at some point. I hope that they will be a financial genius who is creative and figures out ways to do this equitably. But I think it's particularly difficult being in a state system where there's kind of a misperception that the majority of our funding comes from the state rather than from tuition, but that is not the case for sure. So, it's really, administrators are kind of between a rock and a hard place. And then there's also they're also facing the demographic shift where there simply are fewer college age students, even though it is now much more the norm for people to attend college than ever before. We're facing a bit of a baby bust kind of moving into this. So I know there's concern on that side as well. So that did not address the issue in terms of any solutions, but just to point out, there are a whole lot of factors involved in this. And I'm definitely sympathetic to the students who are really frustrated on that side.
Kind of maybe pivoting away for a second, a lot of what we talked about seems to provide an outlook that is kind of bleak for educators moving forward. And I'm curious, for the educators on this panel, what advice do you have for someone who wants to be an ed major? Especially with what we keep hearing about kind of these high burnout rates and a lot of these issues.
Okay, I guess I'll take that one first. So it's funny, I actually had a student observer last year. She observed me remote, and I think she learned a lot, which I told her, I hope you never have to use any of what you're learning right now. And then she student taught with me in the fall and got to experience that transition back into in person, which was not an easy transition. I would say for those who are looking into becoming educators, you have to do it for the love of the kids, not the content. I loved history. I was a history nerd in college. If you go in thinking you're going to inspire a bunch of future historians, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You'll get those kids occasionally who, yeah, you're inspired me to be a history major, but that's not what you're there for, right? You're there for the kids. So you should go into education because you love working with young people. My piece of advice would be learn to say no early. When you're a young, energetic teacher, a lot of people will ask things of you because they want to utilize your energy, but burnout is a real thing. You're looking at, you want to sustain yourself for a 25, 30-year career. Then you need to learn how to prioritize your time. And I will also say that, as a young person, when you go into the field, you may not have kids, you may not have a relationship or other things that take your time. You're very excited to get your first job. There may be an inclination to put too much of yourself into your work, to make your work the sole focus of your life. And that's hard not to do when you have a really fulfilling job, right? A job where you really impact people, right? But if you do that, at some point in your life, you're going to have that relationship. Maybe you're going to start that family. Maybe you're going to have kids. And then suddenly you're caught in this choice where, what do I give up? And you want to keep being that 120% educator you've been, plus live your family life right. You're definitely going to burn out. So I would say when you start your career, build that time for yourself into your schedule, those things that you love doing, that time you're going to spend with friends and family, so that you don't overwhelm yourself. It is a great career and very fulfilling. But it can definitely be the kind of career that you can overextend yourself and become burnt out, and then you can't help anybody if you're not taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I'll agree with all of that. And I think what's difficult is that when teachers come in very young, I was 22, and you lack the perspective of older people. You don't know really what it takes to build an adult life, and I do think that young teachers can very easily get burnt out. I also think that there's really not a lot of support for young teachers, and that's one of the things that really could change the whole ball game, is if we looked at the new teachers coming in as like part of our collective responsibility in a way. But I think that teachers can be very isolated. It's a very independent job in a lot of ways, and I think it attracts a lot of people who want to be very independent. And there's not necessarily a natural collaboration that happens. It has to be an intentional collaboration. But, systemically, if you think about it, schools could really foster that kind of thing. They could really provide structures for teachers to really be working together and reflecting and reevaluating and sharing and helping and mentoring and all of that. But schools are very, in a way, they're traditional institutions that have had a formula that's worked pretty much the same way for over 100 years, and there's less incentive to adapt to maybe what's more necessary now. But I really think that if we had structures to offer more support for new teachers, it's a great job. It really is. It's a great career. It's a great life. And if you like young people, and like to be, I like to be around young people. I like the energy. I like the optimism. I like the whole life ahead of you kind of feeling is just, it's really, really nice to spend your day with people who look at the world that way. I think a lot of people could really like it, but it's difficult. It's structurally difficult, and there's not a lot of help. There's not a lot of support. But I really think there could be. I think, and it may be one of the things that comes out of COVID is that we do, lack, we are fully staffed here at Onteora, but that's it. If, we don't have extra people, we don't have enough substitutes, we, that kind of thing makes it tough. And I know there's people out there who could make really great contributions to the school. So it really, like, the schools need to really think through that.
I will third everything Shauna and Alicia just said, and basically just add that pretty much every point the two of them just made also applies to people who are wanting to get into the mental health field, whether that's a school counselor, mental health counselor, psychologist. Same risk of, going into it overly zealously, throwing yourself into it without enough support, without enough supervision and mentoring, burning out too quickly. But if you can avoid that, awesome field, very rewarding, very, very satisfying.
Shauna, I want to follow up with something that you said earlier about kind of managing work and life at the same time. I'm curious how COVID and the onset of online learning kind of changed that, because it kind of, I think, blurred that line between those two things. I'm curious how your experience changed with the onset of online learning.
It was really, really hard. Like I said, I had a third grader at home, who was, her school went hybrid a lot sooner than mine, but she was still home half of the week. And so I was watching her out of the corner of my eye while doing my work and teaching my classes. And that was just really hard. And I know that was hard for a lot of parents, but especially a lot of moms in many different industries. Because if your kid can't go, unfortunately in our society, school is also babysitting, right? And so if you are in a family where both parents work, or a single parent family where the parent works, and the school is closed, that hampers your ability to work. So I think that's another systematic thing that that needs to be looked at, and it also made me reflect too on the division of labor. I live in a pretty progressive household, but I still think there's a strong, division of labor falls more typically to, whoever's considered mom in that family, regardless of what their gender is. Like, there is usually a parent that is probably doing more than the other one. And that's really hard. And that's something we need to contend with as well.
Sticking on this theme a little bit, but maybe turning the lens around, kind of want to, as we enter the end on an optimistic note, first of all, I kind of want to believe that there might be an opportunity here to catalyze some positive changes in public education, which I know Alicia mentioned earlier, that we should rethink how public education works. There's a lot of money in federal COVID relief funds that's going to end up in K through 12 schools. And here in New York, Governor Hochul's proposed executive budget would increase funding for schools, foundation aid, and the SUNY CUNY system. And aside from all that, we just kind of know how bad things can get now. So this is a question for everyone, and maybe we'll start with Sophie. What is one sort of concrete thing you'd like to see change in education?
Gosh, what would I want to see? I feel like what I want to see is what I have, because getting back has been absolutely amazing. All of my teachers are amazing. Subtle shout out to Ms. Curlew because she's my teacher for 2 classes this year. Yeah, I want to see in education and also the world in general that this period of reflection, personal reflection for me, for the world, kind of reflection on politics, on the implications of this pandemic. I think we haven't fully talked yet about all of the changes that the world is going through. I think there has been some urgency to get back to normal. And what I would push for is more integrating what we've learned and changing what normal looks like. And I think all of these changes that the pandemic has prompted will allow it to be a real catalyst for social change in education and in general.
I agree with what you said, Sophie. I think that also our schools have been given this incredible opportunity to make our classrooms more accessible using the technology we have available to us. On our campus, there was a documentary released, maybe somebody knows more about this situation, where one student who had a lot of disabilities and had trouble going to class every day wasn't able to continue being a student at New Paltz because of those disabilities and the ways that they restricted her from attending class. And then a couple of years later, the pandemic happened, and of course everybody was able to graduate without attending class every day, which is really frustrating. And I think for that to have happened before the pandemic is frustrating in one way, but for that to be something that can continue happening after the pandemic, when we know how to make our classrooms accessible to anyone, is really, really disheartening. I think that making it possible for people to join class online is something that could be done really simply, especially for lecture-based classes where classroom like participation isn't really something that's like super important, is something that would help students who have both physical disabilities and then mental illnesses as well. There have been so many days, and like I'll even speak from personal experience, just because I think it's so important. I think if we all did, our schools would realize that this is a majority of students that this is impacting. There have been so many days where I couldn't get out of bed. And as I mentioned before, like I'll know exactly what's going on in class and I'll still have like my grade be impacted by not showing up. And I think that that's understandable because the way that school has always worked has always been that you have to show up. But I think that now that we have technology available to us, we have to make a change based on the issues that we're seeing. And to respond to a question that I saw in the chat about how school administration has how receptive school administration has been to student needs, I think, sorry, I was reading it. I think that the schools, a lot of school systems, and I would say our school system has been receptive to what the majority of students need. So if we could look at more of the research and see that like the numbers that Professor Vermeulen shared at the beginning about how many students are impacted by like emotionally by what's going on, we would realize that there's a really big percentage of students who would be really, really greatly impacted by more leniency in terms of attendance policies. So I think that attendance policies and live streaming classes are the two biggest things that I would love to see switched based on what we've seen happen during the pandemic.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Sophie and Amaya said. I think that we have to learn the lessons from the pandemic and try to integrate them because a lot of valuable things were learned about how we should change education. I personally would like to see an end to high stakes state testing. I think that also disadvantages certain groups of students. And keeping in mind with, we talked about with flexibility and different styles of learning and letting students find their own creativity and passion. I would love to see it replaced with something where students work on maybe a series of projects in different subject areas as a replacement to the Regents exams, which are not assessments which align at all with real world skills or the type of things that will, skills that students will need in college. So I would love to see that happen. And then we could get away from teaching to the test and really help students find their passion and their purpose and create things that are meaningful to them that they will remember. I grew up in a state that didn't have standardized testing, and in a time period before standardized testing of that nature, the high stakes, you have to pass it to graduate. And I still remember really meaningful projects from my high school classes where I got to pick the topic and pick the book and pick how I was going to show my learning and sit down with the teacher and talk about how is it going to be assessed. I mean, that was exciting stuff. And I wish I could bring that to my classroom.
I'm glad Shauna said that, because I was sitting here thinking, do I say we need to get rid of the Regents exam, or should I just keep that to myself? But, as we reevaluate everything, I even think for this year, the Regents exam is looming over us, so that, it really restrains us in terms of what we feel is the necessary thing to do or the right thing to do. And, I think that we're going slower. We're thinking about social emotional skills. We're thinking about trying to meet all of the needs of the students who are in front of us. And then, I'm very conscious that once we get back from spring break, we're going to be on a race to make sure everything is covered so that, any student who wants to get 100 on the Regents can get 100 on the Regents, and any student who struggled all year can get a 65 on the Regents. And it's so disappointing after all of the reevaluation and all of the thinking that we've done this year, that we'll just be kind of right back in that mode of sorry kids, there was a pandemic, but still got to take the test. And I think that it is time to really, consider those kinds of things. And I hope that people, with power at the state level are considering. I hope that there are some teachers who've had similar experiences, to the rest of us here, who really are calling into question the way things are done. I just think it's hard to think of what else would be, the one change, to make things better. But I think just having more flexibility, and also, having the recognition that teaching and learning is really all about relationships between teachers and students. And that's the way we teach best. It's the way we learn best, that there has to be a positive relationship between the teachers and students, and that if it takes a little bit longer to make that because things are different and things are online, then it takes a little longer to make it, but that it still has to be a priority. And I guess I wish people in education, I think elementary teachers know that. I think they know that they have to love the students, and that's how learning happens at the elementary level. And I think a lot of, high school teachers, once you get into subject areas, people can become really focused on their subjects, and less focused, on relationships. I mean, of course, a lot of teachers really do know that. But I think that the messages that we get and the way people think about teaching is that it's because you love history or it's because you love math, when actually it's because you love kids. And that I just wish that would be more more explicit, more known, that's really the key to everything.
What I hope we see is resources dedicated to schools, particularly money. Some of that I hope comes to the college level, but especially K through 12. The fact that there is one school counselor for 1,200 students at Shanna School is unbelievably ridiculous and problematic. The fact that teachers are burning out because they're working their rears off and not getting the financial compensation. And I really hope, so many parents had to go through that experience of being the teacher / babysitter for their children during the pandemic. And I really hope that leads to some kind of lasting wake-up call that the work is, yes, incredibly satisfying, but incredibly difficult and incredibly undercompensated. So higher salaries for teachers, more positions for support staff, including mental health. Let's implement sabbaticals for K through 12 teachers so that they can get some time off and recharge and get retrained and all of that. So I don't know, that's the main thing that I hope for.
Kind of looking ahead to this last stretch and maybe pivoting towards something a little bit more optimistic, just asking everybody, I'm curious, what's one thing you're hopeful about or grateful for, looking ahead towards the end of this year or the bulk of these coming months?
I'll start. I have been grateful to be back in the classroom physically with my students from August through now. I am very much looking forward to being in the classroom without a mask on so I can actually see their faces for the first time. That's going to be amazing when we come back from spring break. And I just hope that continues. I hope that we are really genuinely coming out of this now and that we're not going to have another setback, because the whiplash of, getting our hopes up and then having our hopes dashed that we're going to be fully pulled out of the pandemic has just really been exhausting and depleting for so many people.
I'm grateful for my students. It has not been an easy transition. Returning back to normal was not normal. And it's been slow to get to know them. I feel like with the masks just coming off the last couple weeks, it's funny, like they're starting to warm up to each other and to me more, and I can see their faces and see when they're confused or when they're upset or when they're smiling about something. But just today, a student who I had 2 years ago approached me after school and asked me about the debate club. And this was a very quiet student. He said to me, I'm changing my ways. He goes, with athletics and with clubs, and I want to join debate. And the kids will just surprise you all the time with things like that, and that's just really joyful. And it's something that we can experience now that we're all back together in person.
Yeah, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for my students. I think that in a way, I'm grateful for the opportunity to try to make relationships with students in different ways, recognizing that like our ways don't always reach everybody. And so you have to keep trying new things. And I think that ability to really stretch and grow. But I also feel in a way grateful for the shared experience, even though in a lot of ways it was a shared experience of trauma. There is, I'll never forget Sophie. Sophie and I have just been through a heck of a 2-year stretch. And I think that, coming out of it successfully, and, being there, like I know Sophie's, seen me when I'm not always at my best moment. And I might've seen her when she's not at her best moment. And just the fact that we can all just acknowledge like, hey, this is hard. Like you have to do your stuff a different way. I have to do my stuff a different way. But like, we are just people trying to navigate this crazy thing that's happened, has been, I don't know, in a lot of ways, I feel more connected to students, especially, students that I've had throughout this whole experience. And I think that it provides a foundation for solid relationships in the future, with future students. And then for the students that we have now, for relationships with their professors as they go on to college. And that I just think that having this shared experience, even just among the group of teachers at my school and administrators and, you know, the rest of the staff, that it's been strengthening in a lot of ways. So as much as we wouldn't have asked for this, there's been a lot of positive happening over the last couple of years.
I've noticed that school has felt more like an intentional community than ever before. I think at first I was kind of expecting to just be like talking to everyone, like just grateful to be seeing people in person, but it's deeper than that now. And I think people are actively changing the rules. Like teachers are talking to students like they're people, and they're aware that students have been through an experience that's just as hard as it was for teachers. And students are trusting teachers and are grateful for teachers. I've had teachers who will just cancel a test and play a game or talk to students, and the way people are so eager to talk in class is something I've never seen before. And I think we're choosing to do that. We're choosing to rewrite the rules, and we're choosing to see the importance of community and go through this experience together with people we never would have before. And I'm very grateful for that, because I feel like for the first time, I feel very welcome at the school. I feel happy to be there and to be choosing these people to be part of my community to go through this experience with. And that's been a really surprisingly good feeling.
I'm really grateful for my professors. I've really seen the ways that our classes have shifted throughout the 3 or more COVID semesters from, oh my gosh, like we have to put everything online, to this is a way that you'll learn it online in a way maybe that's even better than you could have learned it in the classroom, to here's one way you can learn it online, or you could also do this other thing, but reach out if you have ideas for me. I've just really been enjoying like collaboration, and also seeing the amount of like research and thought is going into making these switches so quickly. I of course haven't been to teaching school, so I don't know how it works, but I imagine that you're taught to teach in in a few specific like modalities, and virtual probably was never one of them. So the fact that I've been seeing so many like advancements in like the way that online learning has happened has been absolutely phenomenal. And then also to my mom, who's in this Zoom, who is a principal at an elementary school in Harlem, because through her I've been realizing a lot of little things that teachers have been putting in that I would have never thought to think about if not for hearing about it at home. So I'm just really grateful, because like I think in most disaster, or in a lot of disasters, teachers become students' second parents or first parents. So I'm really grateful for like the educational and emotional support.
I just want to thank all the panelists for coming on. This was really, really great. I want to thank the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz again for co-sponsoring this event and letting these kinds of conversations happen. And I just want to thank everybody for being able and willing to share some of their struggles and some of the pains that they've endured and some of the ways that they've overcame them. I think these conversations are infinitely important, and for everyone in this Zoom, for everyone who participated, I can't thank any of you enough.
Everybody, I'm going to put a link to Ryan's story in the chat just now. It's a really deeply reported and very empathetic feature about a lot of what we've been talking about. So I hope you'll read it, and I hope you'll continue following the river. Thank you again.